Hi everyone, so today we're going to do an exercise that's a little bit in the playing with the idea of an occult life of clothing. So this is a title of my dissertation, Death Piles, Dead Labor, and Dead White Men's Clothes, and it's picking up on a theme around death and actually rebirth in the secondhand markets, and not just for clothes but for a lot of different consumer items that kind of have this history of supply chain, and before they're in the supply chain they're also materials, and they get transformed into items that get then sold and shipped around the world, then get used especially in centers of consumption like the US, but then they get again kind of sent back into the global south. This is a picture of the Atacama Desert in Chile, where there was an enormous problem with people dumping secondhand clothes. And secondhand does not necessarily mean used. It can be new, just unused and on the secondary market. And there was a fire later on. People think that it's to conceal who was actually responsible for dumping these clothes in. But regardless, there is a kind of a colonial nature to the circulation of these clothes that comes from a colonial past in the history of trade and fashion and consumerism. This is not just valid for fashion, it also is valid for furniture and many other goods, but maybe less evidently than it is for these clothes ended up in many places in the global south. So again, we're inspired by methods of speculation, that the idea is that speculation helps us uncover facts. So this is not just about thinking, it's about placing the familiar items in unfamiliar situations, and this will help us create additional knowledge that remains usually hidden. So here we go. Let's start at the Goodwill. So the Goodwill is a place where a lot of these objects ended up who have been kind of considered discard. They by whoever donates them end up at the Goodwill. They're not quite trash, but they hold value, but they have been discarded. And this centers of distribution is where a lot of resellers and people who work in the secondhand space go and kind of pick up some of these items. This is not necessarily true for people who buy bales or who have other methods of purchasing, but for many resellers, this is the center of distribution of these things. And through my ethnographic work, I've gathered the ways that resellers or people who, again, secondhand laborers, go around looking for these different objects and trying to find the value, sort of reviving these objects into the circulation of the market. And this is how we call them, like zombie objects. Objects that have been secondhand have like this aspect where they've been sort of quote unquote dead, and then they get relived multiple times, possibly by this secondhand market. And before they get sold, however, they live somewhere, and sometimes they live with you in your house. And this happens commonly for many resellers, where they have a house and their house is also the place where they store their things. And so they get quite overwhelmed by the amount of things that they have, and specifically by their death piles, this kind of collection of things that they've gathered often from thrift stores, very carefully, kind of one by one selecting these items, but then they accumulate in their personal space, and they call this a death pile. And this is from groups on Facebook Marketplace, where people try to motivate each other to keep their death piles organized or to list them, and this kind of helps feeling less overwhelmed, but it keeps happening. Somehow these death piles keep accumulating. And so from this theme, like there are people living with them, there are animals living in the middle of the death piles. From this idea of death piles, Zaria and I were discussing about what would be an exercise that kind of talks about these circulation of these objects. So Zaria came up with this idea of writing an obituary for one of your items on your death pile or that you're planning to resell. This is the title of a group the death pile destruction that I thought was very interesting. And then this obituary should not just consider the clothes that are currently in your death pile. It should think about also different temporalities of the clothes. So as I mentioned earlier, these clothes get often or these items get often kind of circulated as discard into the global south. And this is a very heavy theme that we are just going to explore superficially, but they end up kind of being circulated in other places. This is an example of a broni wawu. A broni wawu is the name that Ghanaians give to in a Khan to the bales of clothes that are sold in the markets of Accra. And this is like the translation of the donation of clothes and then the use of secondhand markets to get these clothes out of the US and into the global south. Another example here in Palestine, and actually the Gaza Strip in 2016, where many of the clothes come from Israel and they get resold in secondhand markets given the precarity that the populations were immersed in because of the occupation. And so some of these markets are interesting because in some ways the Palestinian people here buying them also find value in these things despite the violence of them being also kind of a part of this colonial circulation. But there's also again an aliveness, a realiving of some of these clothing, and both in Ghana or in the markets in Colombia, in Chile, something happens with these clothing. And so the exercise of today we'll also consider these colonial histories, and what we're going to do is to think about as in first person, as if you wear one of these pieces of clothing and you're actually writing one of your obituaries of discard and rebirth. What would your clothes or your items for resale say? So pick one item that you have bought or acquired for resale and write its obituary in first person. In addition to telling the story it has with you, include an origin story, how it was circulated and used previously, and where you think it will go after it leaves your hands.